60% of USAID's programming is life-saving humanitarian assistance or global health programming to prevent critical diseases and to help heal and treat people. 60%. And yet these, again, falsehoods about projects that are allegedly going on here or there have come in such a short time to define USAID's reputation, including with Republican supporters of USAID who have stood with the agency over decades, who have seen these programs in the field, who have offered great insight and wisdom about how we can strengthen these programs and make them more cost effective. So it's just really important that the misinformation be put to one side. I know this is easier said than done, and that people remember what USAID is offering the American people and what it has done on behalf of the American people for 6 decades.
We have some breaking news that came in over the break. A federal judge has just paused the USAID administrative leave. After hearing arguments in Washington, Judge Carl Nichols says he will grant the plaintiff's request for a temporary restraining order or pause of the planned administrative leave for thousands of USAID employees. Judge Nichols saying this, quote, "I will be entering tonight, sometime between now and midnight, a limited, very limited, temporary restraining order that will be directed at the placement of the 2,200 or 2,700 employees on administrative leave and then the accelerated removal of people from their countries. The administrative leave for 2,200 USAID employees was scheduled to begin tonight at 11:59 p.m. What does this mean?
Well, Judge Nichols is an extremely thoughtful judge, so that he's landed on this is a sign that, what this administration is trying to do is probably well outside the legal and constitutional boundaries. In the last segment, Andrew used an important word, which was destruction, which seems to be the intention here. But I think it's destruction that's much broader than USAID. Under our constitutional law, under statutory law, the president is supposed to administer the programs that are appropriated by Congress. Mm-hmm. Well, I think this administration would like to change that. So I think what they expect to happen is this TRO just got granted. Maybe it becomes a preliminary injunction, and they're going to appeal that as quickly as possible and try to get it in front of a favorable Supreme Court, where they hope they can really rewrite the playbook in terms of presidential powers.
What precedent would they argue, though, for stripping away congressional? I mean, he was impeached for this, for stripping away congressionally approved funds.
Yeah, there's not a lot of precedent, but there has been a change in personnel on the Supreme Court.
That's a good way to put it. Corinne, what do you understand this to mean for the workforce of USAID?
Well, it extends this period of limbo, honestly, would be my gut reaction to it. Certainly, it is a stay. It's a reprieve from the imminence that they were facing of, having to put on administrative leave and the timeline of having to get out of country if they wanted the government to help fund their relocation costs. But it's not clear yet what the end game is, right? I mean, we may be in this position for a couple more weeks, a couple more months. I don't know how long it would take this type of case to move through the courts, but it doesn't solve the final question of, what happens to this agency? And remember, if the agency goes away, the agency funds a whole lot of projects, an entire aid sector, basically, that relies on this money, these grants, these awards. There's radiating effects as well, because the United States has been pulling back contributions to various international agencies that do similar work. So again, as far as the workforce is concerned, the fears are stayed for a while, but I think they're probably still there, given that people don't know what the end game of this is and what they can do thereafter, given that it's not just one agency of government. It's like a whole sector that could be going away if these orders are allowed to continue at some point down the road.
Andrew.
So I just want to make sure people understand sort of the legal frame. There's tons of important things to say about the consequences, like why should one care about USAID? I'm not the person really for that. In terms of legally what's going on is all sorts of problems when you act so precipitously. One, when you have just contractors, if you just say, oh, wait, by the way, come back, you're not getting any more money. Well, they have contracts. So you may.
Like the farmers that provide the wheat or the peanuts.
Exactly. So you have Americans who are providing the material. And then you also have vendors. Like, not everyone who works at USAID is an employee. Some of those people are under contract. So all of this could be a huge amount of waste because you've breached those contracts. That's one bucket of problems. The second bucket is the same thing we've been talking about in terms of the Department of Justice and the FBI, which is people have rights. Yes, you can fire people for cause. You can downsize. There are all things you can do. But the reason it takes a while is because people have rights. And if you just say you're gone, it reminds me of the Muslim ban. If you do it precipitously, you end up with the same incompetence that we saw in Trump 1.0. This is not better. The reason you're seeing all of these TROs is because the judges are saying, wait a second, there are hoops you have to jump through. You, Nicole, you're entitled to be heard before this happens. And so that's like a second bucket before you do this. And then the third is Congress, which is like Congress has the power of the purse. You can't just take that funding and say, you know what? I'd like to spend it on something else. Well, you know whose choice that is? That's Congress's choice. They may not be speaking up, but that is illegal to do that. So you have these three buckets of legal issues where you really have the sense that this administration is, we don't care, what are you going to do about it? And that is why you are seeing for the past week court after court after court. And these are judges, by the way, these judges are not the sort of like, oh, these are Obama judges or Biden judges. You are seeing this across the board because those are judges who believe in and have taken an oath to the rule of law. And that's why you're seeing these, where it ultimately leads, we'll see it. Much of this will end up in the Supreme Court. But I really want to make sure people understand that there are rights here that courts are saying have been violated. And don't think that even though you heard about Project 2025 and that these people are going to be so much better in terms of implementation, the reason you're seeing all of this happening in these TROs is the same incompetence.
Another setback for President Trump is his rush to try to rule without governing leads to having his plans trimmed, dropped, or outright blocked. Trump began the week backing down from his threatened trade war and ends it with another court ruling trimming his efforts to govern without law or Congress. A judge pausing parts of the attack on USAID. That plan appears to have been mostly hatched not by Trump, but by someone who claims to wield powers on the president's behalf, Elon Musk, leading to this new Time magazine cover with the arch reference to him behind the Resolute desk appearing to be some kind of president in his own Oval Office. This is striking. It follows other covers and commentary that have made similar points. You're probably familiar. Early on, right before the inauguration, you had the New Yorker magazine cartoon showing Musk, not Trump, getting sworn in with President Trump. You can see the tuft of blonde hair in the cartoon being sort of pushed out of the frame. Now, politicos know that when Time runs a cover like that, it can be the kiss of death for Trump allies who are stealing his press, or perceived as such. In fact, just last night, we showed you the first-term Steve Bannon Time cover, which stoked a rivalry. That was before this new Red Time cover was published. I have more on the politics of that in a moment. While any potential vibe shift here against Musk matters because his actions are impacting real people, his standing to claim authority on behalf of Trump does turn on and require his ongoing proximity or alliance with Trump. And right now, Musk's efforts to gut the aid agency, to oust staff are ongoing. Courts could later roll some of this back, and some things are being trimmed, as I mentioned. But meantime, Musk's push, well, it already has the agency's name being scrapped, literally pulled down, you can see there, off the headquarters. Musk trying to seize sensitive information and override congressional decisions. His teams involved in several different agencies when he's not a cabinet leader of any of them, actually. There was a confusing scene at the Education Department today where some Democrats made a point to show that Musk's aides, apparently, because it was a bit confusing, were trying to block basic access for people to walk into the building, including from a co-equal branch of government. Even conservatives and Trump allies are noticing Musk's personal agenda can compete with theirs. He has these conflicts, expensive government contracts. He stands to make more from new Trump rule changes, more money, ending programs which had boosted competitors to Musk's Tesla, a move which we will always show you the evidence and the details. Elon Musk himself said the thing that they're now doing could be devastating to his automobile rivals.
I guess that there would be like some impact, but I mean, I think it would be devastating for our competitors, but and it would hurt Tesla slightly. But long term probably actually helps Tesla.
That's now what's happening. Now, Elon Musk may get away with some of this. He may execute on these plans in a way that things are happening. I just showed you some of them. Although picking enough fights with enough different sources, including those other business rivals, could take a toll. And remember, this is someone who has different types of experience, but almost no experience working inside the U.S. federal government. The tactics he used in business, which have at times worked in the past, what they call rush and break things, it's different here. And we are in the early days, and it's already sparking more pushback when tried through the federal government. Judges already ruling against him. More cases coming. Attorneys general in 13 different states moving against what they call allegedly unlawful Musk actions. And that there, which I've just ran through in a couple minutes, that's just some of the law and substance. Then there's the politics I mentioned. Let's be clear. This is exactly the kind of cover that is dangerous for the star behind the presidential desk there. And anyone around Donald Trump knows that. Trump was famously upset at his aide Steve Bannon upstaging him on that cover I showed you and mentioned yesterday, the Time magazine cover, with the storyline about Bannon, not Trump, but Bannon being this great manipulator, which implied that it was Bannon really calling the shots. Now, that concern or that dynamic has even more evidence right now with all of the stories we and our colleagues here at MSNBC and many print reporters have been documenting that obviously Musk is calling big shots. And now he's getting presidential-type press. Reporters documenting this. And we know Trump obsesses over press coverage. Now we have the same glory bestowed on an advisor that we know upsets Trump. Both of them even, whether you consider it playfully or even disrespectfully, referred to as a president, President Bannon. Can anyone stop President Musk? That's from this month. And then out in the public, people on the internet using social media. Of course, Musk is a social media baron himself. They're getting in on this with jokes and trolling about Donald Trump's supporting role. This is all familiar because this is how people in power tend to have conflict. I don't want to go too deep here, but there are ancient teachings about how history might not, quote, repeat itself, but human nature endures. So you see a lust for power and greed and jealousy. These are things that animate people, both the ruler and the ruler's inner circle. In fact, with this being the story tonight, I want to remind you, we recently heard from a very interesting scholar of power strategy, Robert Greene. He discusses what he calls certain laws that endure in power clashes across history, across continents. And his very first law, back in the news tonight, is never outshine the master in your desire to please or impress. Do not go too far to display your talents, or you might accomplish the opposite. The leader will eventually resent you, potentially oust or crush you. Bannon lived that lesson. Now, Musk clearly thinks laws don't apply to him. And maybe that's been true sometimes with U.S. laws, which can be slowly applied in court. And everybody knows this. You don't have to follow the news to know this. In this country, like others, sometimes those laws are applied less strenuously against the rich and powerful. But what about a foundational law of power? Could that still apply even as somebody routes around the other laws? And I'm using the words directly here, right? A law of power is not passed by the government. But the very power and fame that Musk wields is what brings Musk some danger here, because his boss, and the president is the boss here. There's no government authority or election that Musk can claim or invoke. It is that fame which also clearly matters to Trump. And that's a reason that power reveals and can divide. A reason scholars have tracked this for such a long time, a reason that other power experts like Sean Carter spoke about how your own assets can be used precisely against you. The quote goes, "The same sword they knight you, they gonna good night you." And that's only half if they like you. That ain't even the half of what they might do. See POC, see success and its outcome. See Jesus, see Judas. See Caesar, see Brutus. See success is like suicide if you succeed. Prepare to be crucified. Bars. Now, that's some poetic license, which also refers to real, known histories of power and power struggles, and violating what we called that first law by Robert Greene, never outshine the master, which is happening right now tonight in a time cover that we know people in Washington are seeing, as well as on their televisions. So what does the president think of all this talk about another president upstaging him? Well, for once, he was speechless.
Mr. President, do you have a reaction to the new Time magazine cover that has Elon Musk sitting behind your Resolute desk? Time magazine.
No. What is that you just heard? It's actually something pretty rare. It's the sound of Donald Trump refusing to say anything to a question on camera, which sounds like some kind of cooling in the Trump-Musk relationship, at least for today, at least for the end of this week. Elon Musk is posting about his personal platonic love for Trump, laying it on really thick, suggesting maybe he's noticed a problem for the two of them here, and he's trying to get out in front of it and get public with it, again, against the backdrop of that cover. Now, there are some facts that still make Musk different than Bannon, who I mentioned, and most other political people in Trump's orbit. Elon Musk is the richest person in the world, running the global X platform, which has more reach than most press barons across history combined, past and present. I mean, he can't just be constrained if there was a political breakup. And he controls this tech medium, which does shape American political discourse, especially on the right. He is not just a staffer or aide to be dismissed. And he is, according to judges, skirting, defying, or breaking laws. And he is, according to power scholars, breaking the very first law of power.
Let's start with our top story. This hour, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency has reportedly been updating the timestamps on old press releases in order to game Google search results to create the appearance of a wave of mass deportations. The Guardian reports that 4-day operation in Colorado, it happened in 2010. The 123 people targeted in New Orleans, that was February of last year. Wisconsin, September 2018. There are thousands of examples of this throughout all 50 states. ICE press releases that have reached the first page of Google search results, making it seem like enforcement actions just happened, when in actuality, they occurred months or years ago. All of the archived ICE press releases soaring to the top of Google search results were marked with the same timestamp and read updated January 24th, 2025. ICE did not respond to the paper's request for comment. However, The Guardian notes that since reaching out, some of the press releases have reverted back to their original dates on Google search. According to the Department of Homeland Security, in the first 2 weeks of President Trump's second term, nearly 5,700 illegal immigrants had been deported. Newsweek reports that if the administration continues deportations at that pace, they would be on track to deport half the number removed during Biden's last full fiscal year in 2024. This validating everything that you have been saying, Joe, to me.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been saying it just because, first of all, the number of people deported by Barack Obama, exceptionally high. He was attacked as a deporter-in-chief, but as Rahm Emanuel says, it was actually, it certainly did not hurt him in the polls at all. But Jonathan Lemire, we also find ourselves at a far different time right now where, and we've talked about this before, first of all, deporting illegal immigrants, extraordinarily expensive. It's an expensive process. So you've got the expenses of it with a $36 trillion debt. with big spending plans ahead, big tax cuts ahead. So you've got that problem and the pressure that's going to eventually come from bonds traders because our debt and our deficits are going to be too high. Number two, it's inflationary. You talk to Donald Trump supporters on Wall Street. You talk to, factories across Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, wherever you go. You talk to small businesses. You talk to family-owned restaurants. They will tell you that mass deportation will make things far more inflationary, make the cost of everything go up because the cost of workers will go up. I'm not saying this is good. I'm not saying this is bad. What I'm doing is explaining to our viewers why it's not as easy to wave a magic wand and do this. That's the second part of it. And the third part is, again, it's just the numbers are like Barack Obama's numbers are going to be extraordinarily difficult for anybody to reach for all of these reasons. Inflation, because your business community doesn't want him doing mass deportations, and again, because it's so expensive to carry out the process in 2025.
Yeah, and let's also remind the viewers, of course, that those border crossings were already plummeting in the last year of President Biden's term. Yes, they had certainly gone up. And the White House, in retrospect, the Biden White House recognized that that was a mistake on a couple levels, including politically. But they really did come down in those last few months. And of course, there was also the bipartisan immigration bill that there was Republican support until there wasn't, because Donald Trump wanted to preserve it as a campaign issue. But you're right. And if this is what Trump is doing, the numbers here, first of all, would be so massive, and it would be so expensive and logistically difficult. We're also seeing some local jurisdictions really try to push back, saying they won't cooperate with all of this. We are seeing there would be the trickle-down effect for the economy. Business leaders already warning the White House, for now, privately. Later, those warnings may go public, suggesting that this could really impact the nation's economy, Elise. But this is a signature campaign promise. This is the number one thing Donald Trump said he was going to do. To this point, it's mostly been limited to pretty showy raids. But if it ends up getting bigger, the numbers do grow. And those who are deported are not just those here illegally who also have committed violent offenses, but rather large numbers of just people whose only crime is that they did cross the border illegally. We're entering a new area there where there could be a lot of pushback.
Well, no, I mean, if he starts deporting hardworking men and women who's separating them from their American-born children, if you see this really have an effect on the economy that starts to upset the business community, yes, he's going to get significant pushback. I think we're a ways from that, though. I think right now he's having the shock and awe version, showy displays of trying to look like he's doing something, and that could be enough to placate his base.
To Joe's point, and it's a critical point, if you put 100 illegals on a C-5A and fly them from wherever in this country to Venezuela, that tab is going to be at a minimum $5 to $7 million. What do you think, Joe?
Well, exactly. And again, that's the real challenge for the administration. It's important, John Heilman, to remember, though, this was what Donald Trump ran on. It also is an extremely popular position and has been for not only a large swath of Republicans, but a lot of Democrats as well, a lot of independents who saw those images of the first two and a half years of the Biden administration and were horrified by what they were seeing. Just an absolute chaos at the southern border. And for people that are going, oh, well, wait a second now, this is just right-wing propaganda. No. Look over the last two elections, what has happened with voters. These border districts that have gone from almost being straight blue to overwhelmingly red, and that shows you that people, even on the border, Hispanics on the border, have said enough is enough. So you do have that political pull for him to look like he is doing something on this in a significant way because he talked about mass deportations. But at the same time, it's a very heavy lift.
It's a very heavy lift. And if you do it at the scale that Trump has talked about in his most florid moments, it would create all kinds of potentially politically devastating images that would prompt the kind of backlash that we saw during the family separation crisis in the first term. In the period after the election, I kept hearing from people who are misinformation and disinformation specialists who would say, pay attention to what is going to happen here, not trying to diminish the potential humanitarian harms that could happen in a big wave of deportation, but look out for the ways in which this administration will try to game social media and other media platforms to make it look like they are doing more than they are doing. They predicted this months ago and said one problem is that they go too far. Another problem is that they bullshit the country about what they're actually doing.
What's happening.
And this is a first sign of it. This working the Google system to make it look like there's more going on. There's really going on. I wish I could say that it was my prediction. It was not. But some of these very smart misinformation people predicted this and pointed at the fact that it's another place in which Elon Musk and his influence over that platform can be complicit in messing with reality in a way that benefits Donald Trump politically. Where he gets the win of, hey, it looks like we're being tough, but they're really not actually causing that much damage or spending as much money as they might have to really fulfill the promises.
Great point.
The next department that appears to be on the chopping block is the Department of Education. Just earlier today, Democratic members of Congress were blocked from entering the department's headquarters. Democratic lawmakers had met outside to protest Donald Trump and Elon Musk's plan to abolish the department entirely, as well as attempting to seek a meeting with the department's senior leadership. Lawmakers were not only blocked by security holding the front door, but also by Department of Homeland Security police seen in multiple videos from members of Congress. Lawmakers were told by security guards stationed outside that nobody had accepted a meeting and that they needed an escort in the building in order to enter the building.
The door, he says he's a federal employee. He won't tell us who gave him permission to do this. All he knows is he's going to stand here and tell the members of Congress who are elected, who vote for the funding for all of them in this building, and for the student loans, and for the Title I families, he's going to tell us that we can't come in and talk with anybody. Is that right?
Joining me now is one of the lawmakers who tried to enter the Department of Education today, Congresswoman Jahana Hayes, Democrat of Connecticut, and a 2016 National Teacher of the Year. It's a great pleasure, Congresswoman. And, let's just get right to the bottom. Who tried to stop you, and under what authority were they acting to block members of Congress? That's the part I have to wrap my head around. Who fund the very department that they're standing there blocking members from coming into the building?
Well, thank you, Michael, and it's great to be here. And that's a great question. We did not get an answer to that. The man who came out, he met us at the door. The door was locked, and then he came out and met us and said we were not allowed entry to the building. We had to be on a guest list. And when I said, well, what is your name? What is your title? All he would say is, I work for the Department of Education. Never said who he was, kept pulling out a badge and pulling it back quickly. But we said, we're members of Congress. We can come into the building. We can request a meeting. Would not even let us inside the building.
Amazing. It's just amazing. Well, it also kind of begs the question, what do you do next? I mean, this is the fourth time or so that members of Congress have been denied access to federal property. It's not a question of what do Democrats do, what do Republicans, what do members of Congress do when something like this happens? What do you think should happen next?
Well, I think that's really important. I think part of the problem is the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, has ceded all of our Article I powers to the president. And in this case, the Speaker of the House should be saying we need to respect the separation of powers. But I know that is not going to happen. So we are bracing for lawsuits. We've sent letters to the department requesting a meeting. 96 members of Congress signed on to this meeting. Outside groups are gearing up to file lawsuits because we read Project 2025. We know what's next. We know what's coming. And Elon Musk and Donald Trump, this whole administration is going play by play in what we saw in this Project 2025. But one thing I don't think people understand. For me, it was important to go to the department because and request this meeting because I'm open to, if you want to audit the department, if you want to make reforms, let's talk about it. Let's work together and see what we need to do. They don't want to do that. They want to tear everything down, just like they talked about in your last segment. And I hope people understand what that means. A lot of the things that Republicans are complaining about that they don't like about the department with curriculum and things that happen in the school, those are local issues, not decided by the Department of Education. What the department does handle is the $1.6 trillion in student loan funds, special education, making sure that students aren't discriminated against, collecting data and statistics from school, preparing educators to teach our students, running Title I programs for our lowest income communities. All of those things will be affected. And people need to understand if those programs are cut, one of two things are going to happen. If the department is cut, one of two things are going to happen. Either those programs are going to go away or their taxes are going to go up to fund their local school systems. Our children deserve better. 49 million children attend public school in this country. And for Elon Musk to come in with no planning, no forethought, and just plow through these agencies with no plan to rebuild them or what's going to happen to the people that are affected is just completely wrong. And the members of Congress are going to stand up to that.
It appears that Elon Musk, Vice President Elon Musk, I guess, I don't know, he's got some role, some official role, thinks that the Department of Education is already dead. In response to Congressman Maxwell Frost's post about the DOE, he said, quote, "No such department exists in the federal government." You're an educator, a former teacher of the year, someone who knows education better than most. You talked just a moment ago about the programs that are impacted both at the federal and state level. What does this ultimately mean for parents out there and school systems across the country that now will have to scramble, to your point, to figure out where those federal dollars come? Because a block grant is not going to cut it. And we know how block grants ultimately work, right?
Yes. And that's just it. Elon Musk's children don't need public schools. They're not relying on the services that are provided in public school. Donald Trump's children don't need public schools. It's my friends and neighbors. It's the kids that I taught. 7.5 million children receive special education services, wraparound services, accommodations, IEPs, the things that they need in order to learn and meet their educational goals. So many of our rural communities that don't have charter schools, that wouldn't be able to take advantage of some of these voucher programs. People need to think about that. All of those children will be denied a public education. When we had our committee hearing yesterday, the chairman said 1 million students access vouchers for private charter schools. They want to take all this money from the Department of Education and put it into voucher programs. There are not enough spaces for all of the children. What are we going to do with all of these kids? You know, and people really need to think about that. A nation that doesn't invest in their children, that doesn't prepare them to be global citizens, to meet the workforce, we are going to lose a whole generation of kids. And it's not just the Department of Education. They're going after funding for Head Start and HHS. I don't understand this fascination or fixation on pulling money back that we use as resources for our children. And they talk about government efficiency. They talk about the budget. They're not going to the top for all of those big ticket items, like military contractors, like closing some of the tax loopholes that they gave to billionaires. They're taking money from the most vulnerable children, from our global aid programs, a fraction of the budget that really helps invest in the future of this country. And parents need to think about that. Democrat parents, Republican parents, grandparents, Everyone needs to understand exactly what this means if the federal government, the Department of Education, is stripped and those services are lost. Before and after school programs, lunch programs, services for students with special needs, all of our resources that schools have, our sports programs, our music programs, all of those things gone. Districts are going to have to make tough decisions about what they can keep, and our kids will have the bare minimum in schools, and teachers will not be prepared.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Congresswoman Jahana Hayes, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
The Trump administration's federal hiring freeze could create a potential shortfall of firefighters ahead of the next fire season. The president's executive order has stopped the onboarding of thousands of seasonal federal firefighters, including those who worked for agencies called on to help battle the devastating Los Angeles area fires. Even though the order does not apply to positions related to public safety, federal firefighters are not exempt, according to a person who works in hiring at the Bureau of Land Management. Let's go right to NBC News correspondent Jacob Soboroff, who is the reporter on this story, and he joins us now with more. Jacob, what can you tell us?
Hey, Mika, good morning. So, yeah, one of the things I think that was a massive relief to people here in Los Angeles as we went through both the Palisades and the Eaton fire was the sight of those green fire trucks pulling up from the U.S. Forest Service and what was really a massive mutual aid effort. There was federal, there was state, and there were local jurisdictions from all over California and all over the country that came to assist in battling what Governor Gavin Newsom told me was potentially the most costly natural disaster in the history of the United States of America. There are around 15 to 20,000 federal firefighters that work for the United States government. Most of them are temporary, either career or temporary, but all are seasonal. And so every year there is a massive onboarding process for many of these positions. And because it's the federal government, there are lengthy background checks that are associated with these firefighters coming on in order to work for the federal government. And this hiring freeze, despite President Trump's executive order on January 20th saying it was going to exempt people that deal in public safety, has effectively stalled the hiring of these federal firefighters all throughout the federal system, at the Bureau of Land Management within the Department of Interior, at the National Park Service, which has its own firefighters, and at the U.S. Forest Service, which has the most firefighters of this whole operation. So there is a lot of concern here on the ground, not just in Los Angeles, where these firefighters came and really helped in the mutual aid effort, but all across the American West, where obviously the fire seasons are getting longer, the fires are getting bigger, the fires are getting more dangerous. And we talked to, actually a tip came through our friends at the Rachel Maddow Show. We talked to an employee who works in hiring at the Bureau of Land Management, and they said hold all offers related to fire positions was the directive that at least this employee in this division got. The level of stupidity and negligence here, this person told me, is enraging. What if there's nobody to show up? How many people died with garden hoses in their hands? Obviously, speaking of the recent fires. So there's a lot of concern. The governor's office here in California is concerned about this. I talked to them yesterday. The ramifications are potentially quite significant.
Jacob, let's talk about another way the Trump administration may be impacting the ability to fight fires there in other parts of the California economy and day-to-day life. And that's as these reservoirs that were in the northern part of the state that the Trump administration, federal officials ordered opened up. Let's remind viewers, this is water not heading to Southern California, and instead water that farmers may now not have when they need it during the dry season later in the year. Talk to us more, state you know so well, about the ramifications and just sort of the anger about this Trump decision, which seemed to be simply about public relations.
The simplest way that I can put it, Jonathan, is when I drove to the Bureau here in Los Angeles this morning, thank God, it's finally pouring rain in Los Angeles. We are in the middle of the winter season. We do not need billions of gallons of water released up into the Central Valley, which doesn't make its way down to Southern California here in the Los Angeles area. Anybody that's seen the movie Chinatown knows how water makes its way to Los Angeles. We have a series of aqueducts and reservoirs and systems that come both from the Sierra Nevada from the Colorado River. I've done stories here on MSNBC about where our water comes from, and even in the face of water shortages, how places like Los Angeles have enough water to do things like sustain itself day to day. And so when President Trump has ordered this federal release of billions of gallons of water that goes up to the Central Valley in the middle of the winter, I don't think it's very hard to wrap your head around how in the summertime, when that water is needed and necessary, it obviously is not going to be there to help us here, not only in Southern California, but even for those farmers in the Central Valley that he says he's doing this to protect.
NBC's Jacob Soboroff, thank you very much for your reporting. We appreciate it.